We're going to switch subject matters this week. We're going to talk about the confluence of species in sports. We're going to try to sort of borrow a phrase here, expand the moral circle. In ethics and sports, we talk a lot about the human implications of our actions, what it means to people when we carry on sport. But in this case, I want to again expand that circle and ask the question of what about other species? And try to draw different sort of lines and distinctions about, okay, when is it okay to drag animals into sports with us? And so there's a couple of readings here. This reading, Mangled Horses, Maimed Jockeys, is from the New York Times. It's long, but simple and easy to read. And there's a documentary video that comes with it. It's a little bit long as well, 27 minutes. I highly recommend you watch the video as well. What you'll see in the video is that the horse racing industry has a long track record, pun intended, of not doing so well by the animals that are involved because there's so much money, because the stakes are so high. There's gambling involved, and that's where that's the money part. And so that creates a huge amount of incentive to do things like use drugs, anabolic steroids, stimulants, painkillers, all sorts of drugs to sort of doctor up horses and get them to run harder and push beyond their limits. And you see high death rates because of this, in large part because of this. And you also see very little to no enforcement of the sports regulations and rules on this. The penalties and fines are virtually non-existent. The incentive structure is set in place to just make money, and the cost to the animals is pretty high. So you can see there's several stories that I link here to this. Take a look at it. And this is pretty consistent with the reading I want you to take a look at this week, Violence Among Beasts, which is written by me. And so here, I want to talk about that paper, go into a little bit more depth on it. So here's the paper itself, Violence Among Beasts by me. The thesis of the paper is that games and sports that harm non-human animals are unethical because they exceed the permissible limits of optional harm. That is to say, you are harming animals just for fun. It's an option. You don't have to do it. It's optional. Sometimes you're allowed to do harm as optionally, but the threshold is very, very low, ethically speaking. So, and the more harm that the game imposes on a non-human animal, the worse the ethical transgression. And so you might say, okay, well, humans harm each other in games and sports too, so they're doing optional harm, sometimes at a very high level. But of course, the difference is humans have the ability to give informed consent, and non-human animals do not. And so that makes a huge difference in my analysis about why it's ethical for humans to harm each other, but not animals. And part of what makes it wrong to harm animals in sports, I'm trying to find a particular section here, is what we call their ontology, what types of beings they are. Whoops, I passed it way up. Here we go. The types of beings they are what we call subjects of a life. They're living, breathing, feeling, thinking animals like we are. Now, of course, we're different in the sense that we have very high degrees of cognitive capacities that make us just different. But at the basic level, so like a level below the high degree of cognition and intellectual capacity that we have, we share a lot in common with most of the animals. We all evolved together. So as I describe here, they are the subjects of a life. And so if you're the subject of a life, to do harm to someone or something that's the subject of a life is a very serious ethical issue. Harming animals is not something we should take lightly. And I want to show you a couple things here, examples. So this is a presentation of the paper that I gave a couple of years ago. Most of this is not that important for us. But here's an example. Okay, so bullfighting, right? So we fight bulls for games, for fun, essentially, for sport. So if you're not sure about what you're looking at here, so this is a bull that's been run at the running of the bulls. He's got sort of I forget what these are called. He's been stabbed several times here. So these are like metal hooks that they stab into him. And the matador here is trying to kill this bull. If you can see this little golden dot here, that is the end of a spear or sword. So the matador is trying to stab this bull, essentially stab it to death. He's trying to either use this blade to sever the spinal cord or puncture the lungs and kill the bull, which has already been weakened before it comes into the battle. And actually, in this picture, you can see the matador is doing a decent job. Let's put that in scare quotes, because the bull is asphyxiating blood here. So he's breathing blood out of his nostrils, which means that his lungs are punctured. There's blood in his lungs, and it's coming out when he breathes through his nose. That's a pretty gruesome scene there, and again, it's being done for a game. We'll take a look at some other examples. So this is Jimmy John. Jimmy John's the sandwich guy. He's a well-known big game hunter. So here he is, very proud of having killed this African elephant. Of course, hunting and trapping are long histories of using animals in the context of games and sports. Fishing in the same way, but across the species line there. So everything's a mammal until now. That's not a mammal. It is biologically different than us. The quality of mind is different, so you got to factor that in. Dogfighting, of course, which you might simply guess. Again, gambling is the prime motivation here. These people are taking bets on which dog will win this fight. That's the story from the Times. Horse fighting, much the same. This picture on the bottom left here is a Horween cow. So this is a company that makes leather for baseball gloves, baseball, sports equipment, basically. What might surprise you is they do not harvest leather as a byproduct of the beef industry. It's the other way around. They raise cattle specifically for its skin, and then they sell off the other pieces of the animal as a byproduct of their industry. So that equipment, you have to ask yourself, like, is it okay to raise a cow specifically to take its skin? The whole purpose of that being existing is so that you can kill it and take its skin. It's an interesting philosophical question. I would argue that no, it's not okay to do that. This picture on the top right is also interesting to me. I think this is Inupiaq Nation. So this is a whale harvest. If you're not sure what you're looking at there, that's a whale that they've killed and brought up on shore, and now they're cutting off chunks of the blubber here. A whale is a mammal. It's biologically much more like us than this fish is, for example. But what's interesting about the practice here, and I've read quite a bit about this, it's a cultural practice. If you speak to First Nations peoples, they will tell you this is not about subsistence. It's not about feeding themselves. It is about culture and the continuation of their heritage and cultural practices. In other words, it is optional. They are doing it as a game, a cultural practice, which don't think that because I'm calling it a game, I'm demeaning it. Games can be profoundly important cultural practices. But the point, again, is that it's optional. And so here, again, we have humans do this too. This is Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, who I'll show you a clip of them in a minute. The difference between them bloodying each other up and us bloodying up a bull for sport, again, is they can agree to it in advance. And it's fairly clear that animals can't do that. They can agree to some things, right? They can give sort of tacit agreements, unspoken agreements to certain behaviors. But the threshold of what we sort of permit as tacit agreement is pretty low. Like, your dog wants a belly rub. All right, like we can assume that he agrees to that. But your dog doesn't want to be, fought in a pit fight like Michael Vick did with his dogs a decade ago. You can't assume that kind of tacit agreement there because there's so much harm involved. We have to go, no. There's only so much we can assume that a dog agrees to. So that's the kind of important bit about this. And the implications of my argument there are pretty clear. There's some other links here that I provide for you. And the last thing I want to say is I highly recommend this documentary called The Game Changers. One of the implications of my argument is that optional harm of animals is morally unacceptable. It's unethical to harm animals when you don't have to. And one implication of that, fairly clearly, is that a vegetarian or vegan diet would be required because you can live totally healthy, happy, normal life without killing animals for food, which of course entails doing harm to them. And so some people push back on that and they go, okay, that's too much, that's too demanding. And especially in the context of sports where people think that they have to be, fueled by high volumes of animal protein to succeed. And this whole documentary, The Game Changers, is basically sort of contesting that idea. So here's a little clip from it. I'll shut up and we can watch this.
When Nate Diaz stepped into the cage to face Conor McGregor, the Vegas odds makers had Diaz as the 4-1 underdog.
He caught him again with a right hook. And another left. And he did with the combination. Diaz trying to finish with a submission. He got it. That's it. He's got the challenge. Diaz. He shot. He's got it. He did. Diaz beats Conor McGregor. Oh, my goodness. Nate Diaz, you just shook up the world. How's that feel?
Hey, I'm not surprised, motherfuckers.
It's a bitter bitter pill to swallow. It was simply a battle of energy in there, and he got the better of that. So 9 days out from the fight, I started eating 2 steaks a day, and it just came back to bite me on the ass, you know?
This was the greatest upset in UFC history, and it turned out Nate wasn't the only plant-based fighter out there.
I stopped eating meat probably like around the end of 2012. I grew up not even knowing about half of these other vegetables. Asparagus to me just came out like 5 years ago. You know what I'm saying? It's just like...
That line cracks me up. Again, so I highly recommend the film just because it sort of turns on its head this idea that you have to have high volumes of animal protein to be a high-performing athlete. But again, the big picture here is that I want to expand the circle and sort of ask this question and push this question of how much harm to non-human animals are we willing to tolerate in the context of games and sports? I think we should tolerate a lot less than we actually do. So give this stuff a look. Let me know what you think.